If we only had a little more time, if you haven't said this about a loved one gone too early, you've certainly dreamt about what it would be like if the best and brightest of society's past could gift us their wisdom and brilliance today. It's the farthest reaching edges of a technology called cryonics that hopes to make this possible via the practice of preserving life by pausing the dying process using freezing temperatures in hopes of restoring good health with medical tech in the future. Pausing death seems like science fiction, but could cryonics mean the end to organ donor waiting lists? My next guest is the CEO and president of Alcor Life Extension Foundation, a nonprofit that has been advocating for, researching, and performing cryonics to bodies and brains since 1972. Today, he's going to sift the possibilities from the possible as we ask the question, could cryonics be the logistical solution for overlooking a science fiction? Grounded futurist, practical innovator, attorney by trade, Mr. James Arrowood. I'm glad you're here.
Wow, that was the best summation of what we do I've ever heard. So I may want to borrow that, license it, whatever we need to do. But that was brilliant. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. When I think of cryonics and when I first heard about Alcor, it took me back to that, I think it was like 1992 Mel Gibson movie, Forever Young. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I don't, but I do know there are a ton of cultural references as recently as the Super Bowl, where the Popeye's chicken commercial, he popped out of cryonic preservation to a world full of Popeye's chicken. So there are cultural references all over. That was the guy from The Hangover, too. So that's kind of cool. But that's literally what we do. And we're the world's experts by 50 years or more on doing that. And what you often see in emerging technology, even electric cars or flying cars, is you see it talked about as science fiction, really for decades ahead of time. And it's really grounded in something, right? I mean, when people talk about these things, the Hollywood writers don't just completely invent it. I mean, they do on some things, but certainly with this stuff, it's grounded in hard science, which is really thermodynamic biochemical engineering. So if you want a mouthful, that's the people I work with on a daily basis. Some of the smartest people on earth, no exaggeration. And people that kind of know more than we do, know more than I do. And that's what attracted me to the position. So I was just a lawyer doing my lawyer gig, and Alcor was one of my clients. I was known for working in kind of emerging technology or science fiction-y space stuff. The only real reason that I was attracted to this was because I knew some of the names behind it. And when the smartest people in the world like start going a certain direction, you're probably well served to maybe start kind of leaning that direction. So I didn't necessarily know all the science, but I saw that the really smart people were going a certain direction. And so I said, you know what? I'm not as smart as they are, but I'm smart enough to follow them. And that's kind of how I landed here.
Well, I love that. Yeah, so we do tend to think of cryonics as like in those pop culture references and definitely like a full body context, but the technology is already being used, which I was surprised to learn about. Can you talk about that? How is cryonics already used and socially accepted?
Well, half of that's true. The second half, I'm not sure yet. But in terms of how it's already being used, well, it's been used for decades now with IVF. And even that was considered at the time, for those listeners who might be old enough, if you recall Jerry Springer or Phil Donahue shows, they would talk about the test tube babies and, oh my gosh, were these kids going to be zombies or not have a soul or something. And of course, we know that's not true now. There are plenty of women I know that use IVF to have children. And so it's that is the same thing conceptually. Now, the scientists are going to get really mad, and I know that. Scientists go get mad. That's fine. We'll talk later. But the point is, IVF is a multicellular structure. It's an embryo that's preserved in liquid nitrogen, and you can freeze various things for fertility and other things. That is essentially what we do at a very small level, right? The trick on the whole operation is scale. I know what people are going to say. They're going to say, yes, but James, that's an embryo. Well, right. But before an embryo, people said that wasn't possible, and that was science fiction, right? And so then they did it. And now it's like, okay, well, we were wrong there, but let's say the next thing isn't possible. And you see that constantly in terms of the cynics and the skeptics when it comes to science. Nothing would get done if people just relied upon the cynics and the skeptics, right? Nothing would happen. The electric car would never happen. I have to live in a world where I look at things whether they're scientifically impossible. Are they violating the laws of physics or the fundamental laws of nature or science? And in this case, we already know it doesn't. We know it works with embryos. Now it's a question of scale. And the scale involves really kind of two key tipping points, or what I call inflection points. Those inflection points are organs. So an organ like the kidney or the liver or the lung or the heart, those are more complex than an embryo, and they have electricity that needs to happen in order for those to work. Okay. The final step, the aspirational goal, which is what everybody fixates on, is whether or not at some point things like whether a brain could be revived or perhaps a whole body. Now that's what you see in science fiction, and that's what's going to be necessary for ultimately for space travel, for instance. So you'll hear about all these billionaires and they kind of allude to maybe their members, and I can't talk about who may or may not be members at Alcor, and everybody tries to get that out of me. But in order for them to reach distant space, this has to work. And they are some of the donors and some of the people that might be involved in the process. That's the ultimate goal. So is it part of our lives today? It is. It's inextricably part of our lives now in science and what have you. The next real hurdle is larger organs. It's been tested in small mammalian organs and worked to a degree. So we know proof of concept that this could work. Now, mind you, if it works at that level, you no longer have organ shortages. You don't need to have organ shortages. So the organ banking, organ transplantation, that's a solvable problem. And it's not solved because of the financial dynamics of it, frankly. You can't buy or sell a viable organ. Viable means still living tissue. It's not something you can start a for-profit business and do, because we don't want to create a black market for organs, of course, and mostly Western countries, the legal system makes it a crime. So none of the for-profit companies are going to dip into that space. That's why there's no money. That's why it hasn't been solved. It's a solvable problem, though. Scientifically, you're not breaking the laws of science by doing this. We know because, again, embryos are already done. It's done. So it's a question of scale. And that's something that, everybody at Alcor, when the media talks about Alcor, they really fixate on the revival part, the brain coming back someday, or the whole body. But to me, on the operational side, the day-to-day work that we do, the day-to-day work is, well, we have to do this smaller scale. Yes, we want to preserve bodies today. We want to preserve your brain today. And people say, well, why do you even bother? Well, you need to have that. That's all part of the process. That's what science is. But in the meantime, I have to do something smaller, something simpler first. And in doing that, you change medicine. We estimate 200 people a day die simply because of the logistics of getting a living organ from point A to point B and matching it properly.
Is that a global number?
That is a global number, but of course, those estimates are probably way low, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't know in countries that don't have good reporting, India, parts of Asia, certainly parts of Russia, things like that. We don't know the true number. That's just a ballpark. But even at that rate, think about it this way. If there were a jumbo jet full of people that died every day that crashed, you can bet that everybody would pause and start solving that problem in flight, right? That would be a national emergency for everybody right now. And yet we just don't get that kind of support yet because the media, frankly, and the notion that this is science fiction. It's not science fiction. Smartest scientists on earth are behind us.
Well, what I think is so interesting is the social aspect of it, is that the thing that sparks our imagination the most is also the thing that we resist the most, from a psychological standpoint. And that prevents the thing that would help us the most in this case, right? Which is organ preservation. So this is why I love having these kinds of conversations, because if we kind of unpack and peel back these layers of our personal resistance, our societal beliefs, and the norms that are around it, then it can actually kind of clear the road a little bit for whatever's next and whatever's possible. Last night, I was reading that last year in 2023, researchers performed the first successful transplant of a functional cryopreserved rat kidney. And I'm sure you already knew about this. I'm sure Alcor tracks all this stuff very
That
closely.
was done in 2007, actually, a version of that.
Oh, really?
With rabbits. Yeah.
With rabbits. Okay.
So what you're talking about, the Bischoff and the University of Minnesota, of course, we're intimately familiar with all that. Yes, the notion on that is by the time the public hears about something, it's in my world in emerging technology 20 to 30 years out of date. So you were mentioning just last year, and that's technically correct with a rat kidney, but it had been done in a rabbit kidney, which was bigger back in '07. I believe it was 7, might have been 11. But the point is, it was at least 10 to 15 years ago. And you're just catching up because the more mainstream university system did it, University of Minnesota. Yeah. I mean, there's rumors about a lot of things that have been done. And, I obviously encounter that. Let me blow your mind for a second. Imagine a head transplant. Now, if you know much about medicine, vascular surgery means that a head transplant is possible today. It's been possible for a long time. Meaning, if you connect the carotids in the neck, you can connect the head to a body. The reason it's not done is the ethics of it is the spinal cord, because we don't have the stem cells to regenerate the spinal cord yet. But technically, if somebody's heart gave out, you had a heart attack, and you could remove the head and you can actually connect that to a body and have it function on machines, allegedly. But these things, there's different parts of the world, they do different things. The science is probably 10 to 20 years ahead of what you're reading about. And that's wild.
Wait a minute. You just said different parts of the world, they do different things. Are you hinting that this has been done?
I'm not I don't All I know is I hear things and once in a while see things. And obviously we have a set of medical ethics, and certainly at Alcor we can't do certain things, but there are rumors that the technology is well beyond what you've read. Because
Okay.
again, what you're reading about are what are considered in the space to be the scientifically valid, meaning they follow the scientific method, they reported, it's what's called peer reviewed.
Right.
And peer review is incredibly important in this space. And in fact, Alcor, we're committing now, we just have a molecular and cellular PhD that started with us, and we have a neurobiologist that's starting in a few days. And so one of our goals is to get more of that peer review, because before you can really get it societally accepted, it has to be peer reviewed. But that doesn't mean that in other places where they have different kind of standards and ways of doing things, that they're not already doing certain things. I don't want to get into too much detail. People can Google all that because, as you know, the president of Alcor, I have to be careful what I say. But let's just say that what is public is probably 10 to 20 years behind
Hmm.
what has already been tested, conducted in some space somewhere. So just use your imagination.
Is Alcor at all participating in research to progress the possibility of organ banking?
Yes, I mean, that is our kind of fundamental eat the elephant bite. And by that, I mean, how do you tackle big problems? If you tackle big problems by trying to swallow them whole, you're never going to succeed. You're going to choke in the process. So I have a process I try to implement in life called eating the elephant. And how do you eat the elephant? You eat the elephant one bite at a time. And before you can ever get to the brain, now the brain, we do a ton of research on. We have a neurobiologist coming on board real soon to start looking at neural synaptic connections. And this has tons of other applications, by the way. Alzheimer's research, epilepsy research, CTE, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Try to say that fast for the NFL, right? Those types of things all relate back to the research that Alcor's either funded or that we participate in directly, either at Alcor or at some labs external to Alcor that we have assisted with or funded. Again, we have neuros. So neuro is the vocabulary. That means your head. And yes, we actually remove people's heads. Not me, but like our scientists, medical people for research. And people, we can talk about that, like Einstein's brain and why that's important and all that sort of thing. But I want to get right out in front of everybody's kind of notion online that, oh my gosh, these people are out there doing this weird science. And it's like, well, yeah, medical schools do gross anatomy labs all the time. Dental schools, you know how they work on human teeth, they actually have human heads that were donated to science. So we kind of have to have an adult conversation about the donations. And when you sign up at Alcor, you actually are signing up as an organ donor. It's under the Anatomical Gift Act that you donate your body. So the same notion. Yeah, it's the same structure, legal structure, as if you donate your body to a medical school or anything else. And I think that's a big misperception online. There are companies that do this for a profit. That's not Alcor. Alcor is the nonprofit. They're not doing the research component. just so you make a distinction.
So I was wondering about that. So what motivates someone to want to become cryonically preserved?
That's a great question. So we have about 1,500 members, which are people that are living. We have over 200 patients, which are people that have been chronically preserved. But really, as it turns out, like any member organization where you have over 1,000 people, that we have a whole scale. There's people that I would say 10%. It's like American politics. There's extremes. And on one end of that extreme are 10% of the people. So let's say 150 out of 1,500. These are approximate numbers. They change every day. We have a wait list right now of over 100 people we're trying to get through just to get them signed up. But
Hmm.
so 150 people say, I don't think this will ever work for me. Like their brain, their body will never come back in a meaningful way. But they want to be like the first heart transplant patient where they knew they were only going to live a week or two, but it helps their grandchildren. It might help with the organ banking, right? It's a legacy. They're contributing to science. So that's 150 people. Then we have another 150 people on the extreme end, on the other side, that say they're convinced it's going to work for them. And they're going to come back either as a computer interface. And we know that's already possible, by the way. That's already possible. That's happening. The Neuralink, if you have a well preserved, I mean, those are living people, but if your brain is still alive, it can be connected to a computer now.
Mm-hmm.
That's reality. Okay. And how deep that goes is probably not public. How advanced that is not public. Right. So that's possible. And those people 100% believe that if their support system, which is really your lungs, your everything from the neck below, is really about supporting this. This is the hard drive of your computer, and everything else is the power center, the interface, the computer mouse, or the monitor, but it's all in support of this. So 150 people believe it's going to work. So that's 300 people. Now we have 1,200 people who are all degrees in between. So they actually think it's 0 to 1%, 1 to 5%. We've actually done surveys of members. So to answer your question, the reasoning varies from, hey, I want a legacy to contribute to the science, and that's it, to I 100% want to come back someday and be part of this group of people that are kind of what I call the Apollo moon landing of
Yeah.
biology experiments, right? And it is like that. You're an astronaut. You're going to an unknown universe in the future, theoretically, where if this were to work, who knows? And of course, there's arguments about, well, gosh, what if it's a dystopian future? Well, dystopian future, they're not going to bring it back. They're not putting money into people and the doers, right? I mean, we got to have a real conversation, like
Yeah.
rational
Yeah.
conversation. And if this works and somebody actually was able to come back from this, and I say if because I'm the president, we don't guarantee that. We don't promise it. We don't know. It's an experiment. But if it worked, I always tell people, like, and they worry about having a job and stuff. And I'm like, look, if you're somebody who's brought back from the past, you're never going to buy dinner again. You're never going to buy a beer again, right? You're going to walk into the bar and you're going to be that person.
One step at a time, probably. Obviously, this is incredibly complex on many levels. It is so wild. It brings up so many fun for me, like the subject of transhumanism, a podcast episode for another day. The subject of questioning, well, what is death? A podcast episode for another day. And maybe we will do those on another day. But I want to know about behind the scenes of the process of the services that you're offering now for cryonically preserving the heads and the bodies of people. It has to be expensive. If someone were to pay cash, what would that cost?
So in the US, and I say this because outside the US, and we have members all over the world, it does cost more because of the travel and things, right?
Yeah.
But in the US, it's 220,000 for the whole body, and it's about 80,000 for the neuro. And let me explain before everybody freaks out. First of all, about 80%, these are approximate numbers, so nobody freak out about it. But about 80% of our members are middle class. I don't have an extra $200,000 check to write to Alcor. Most people fund it using life insurance, and if you use the right kind of life insurance, it's about the average cost of a funeral. So you're going to pay this anyways if you're getting buried in some fashion or another. They do this because they want to donate to science, but the process is you sign up, you get your funding in place. The reason it's so expensive, let's just get that out of the way. Out of that $220,000, there's actually two separate entities here. One is the part that does the research in the hard science. That's what I run on the daily. We're the ones that go get the bodies and do the research component. There's a separate entity basically called, it's a trust, and it's, you want it this way. This is a good thing. It has its own board. That board has people that are in cryonic preservation for the most part. All right. So they have a vested personal interest in preserving what we call the patient care bay. That's the long term storage component. But the reason I bring that up is out of that 220,000, about 140,000 goes right off the top. Because guess what? You have to pay for that space. You have to pay for the liquid nitrogen. You have to pay for a caretaker. It's just like having a cemetery, for lack of a better analogy, but like a cemetery has to mow the grass, it has to upkeep everything, right? Well, that money goes away. I don't get to touch it. We don't get to spend it, but I'm left with about $80,000. That sounds like a lot of money. The chemical that we use to do the cryopreservation is actually about $50 to $100,000. And we don't make a profit on it. Well, that's what we pay for it. It's extraordinarily expensive because it's actually these tiny little, essentially fish proteins. Again, scientists don't get mad at me. I'm not a scientist. All right. They're far more complex than that. But what they essentially do is they prevent ice nucleation in your body. And ice nucleation is what kills living cells. So when you hear about freezer burn on a steak and why is it weird and it's got that little frost on it, that's a bad steak, right? That doesn't taste good. That doesn't look right. Well, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent that from happening so your cells are still viable at the time of death. That chemical, again, 50 to 80,000 on the whole body, maybe 100. We actually lose money on the recovery of bodies overall as an average. So about 60% of our revenue is actually from donors. So the donors actually make up the ground. Again, we need to get the bodies to do the research, so we kind of take that hit. But the process is you sign up as a cryopreservation member. It's about 60 to 70 pages. I mean, it's this lengthy contract because we know that people may challenge that. They hear $200,000 and cousin Johnny, who never met you, comes out and says, I want that money, right? So we have these contracts, you sign them. Once you get signed up, you get assigned a patient number, and that makes you kind of anonymous in the system. Some people want to be anonymous, and some people are not. Some people are public. So you sign up, and then we put you in our system, of course. And if you ever have any health issues or anything else, we ask that you let us know. So even if you're going in for just a common surgery, we have a medical response director who's actually a trauma nurse by training. So we have this whole group of medical people, and then they monitor your medical situation. And if something looks dire, we'll send a team out. That's called a standby team. That standby team can go anywhere in the world, and they do.
And how long do you have to do that before the process is no longer viable?
Okay, so there's two kind of ends that can happen here. One is called a straight freeze. A straight freeze means we can get your body at any time, but that's not optimal. What we really want is where we can cryoperfuse you with the expensive chemical. That can vary in time. It depends on how you're kind of cooled at the time of death, anywhere from immediately to 12 to 24 hours. It depends a lot on circumstances. We actually try to get to you in advance. So we have a standby team outside the hospital. Most people die in the hospital, statistically speaking, or in hospice. So a good percentage of our cases, we're able to have the standby team ready. But accidents happen. That's part of the job. It is really challenging for our staff. For me personally, like an accident, we had a minor recently that was a teenager that died in an accident. Really hard stuff because you feel for the parents. You often know the parents if they're members. You know, I had a call one time of somebody I'm close to, and they had a child that passed unexpectedly. You know, and I just felt terrible. But we have to do our jobs, and so I had a team within 15 minutes deploying.
Wow.
If we can get to you within hours, then we have a reasonable chance of actually doing the cryoperfusion and getting you preserved that way. But yeah, we have to be on standby 24/7. People tend to die on holidays. So, like, I've been at Alcor with the patient. So, you're dealing with death on Christmas. Every Christmas, somebody dies. It's just a weird dynamic of this situation. Yeah, it's kind of wild. But you know, you need to be there. You're honoring their last wishes. That's what my staff looks at. We have retired military and we have active hospice nurses, trauma nurses, surgeons, you know, and so they're kind of used to this kind of work. For me, it's definitely a little bit different. I have to focus on that this was their wishes and that we're honoring that. But yeah, it's a difficult job and you want to do the best job possible, right? So
So
ideally before death. we're there.
So, how does this change the mourning process? How have you observed it change the mourning process? Are loved ones visiting their loved ones in a cryonic state? Okay.
Yes. So a good example, if anybody wants to learn kind of more in a neutral way, the press is often negative about us. They just don't understand we're a nonprofit. But if you watch, I think it's called Hope Frozen on Netflix. Our youngest member patient, Matherin, was in, I believe, Thailand, and she's about 2.5 years old at the time she died. I think that gives a real good view of kind of the family mourning process that's involved. We do allow families to come visit. And in fact, I encourage listeners or the public to sign up for a tour. You do have to sign up in advance because we do have security and things. But I don't want to hide what we do. We are a lab. And if you come to Alcor, I think it really opens your eyes to the fact we're a working lab. You come in, you're going to see scientists, you're going to see medical people, you're going to see sciencey stuff. And so the morning process, I'll give you an example. It's hard in a mental way in this job. Maybe something I didn't anticipate or really fully understand until you're in the middle of it. But you have a parent coming in. We have an operating room. The operating room is there because part of our procedure, you have to access the carotids or you have to access the aorta to actually use the body's circulatory system to pump the cryoprotective agent. And so the family comes into the operating room, and in this case, they had certain cultural norms, and we try to respect those within the confines of a medical slash lab space. But in this case, they had incense, they burned incense as part of their kind of death ritual or what have you. And we allow that to a degree. And then, there is a time on this. You have to kind of limit the amount of time after death because we have to start doing things. Like time to temperature is really critically important. And so for them to get what they hope for in terms of the result of cryopreservation, we have to kind of give them maybe 20 minutes, a half hour. And in the meantime, we're actually like staging things and prepared. And our DART team is our deployment and recovery team, and they're the ones that go recover the bodies and they do the initial stabilization. It's called. They're either military or medical, and so they have a lot of experience, unfortunately, in kind of notifying people of deaths of loved ones and those sorts of things. And I've really been touched in seeing how you have these really ultra alpha military. A lot of them are former special forces that come in and they humble themselves in front of the families and show their respects to the families, and especially if you have a child, that's incredibly difficult. But man, the families, I think they feel respected and honored. I hope they do. And then we show that respect, but then we have to say, look, you know, there's only maybe 10 more minutes, and then we really have to start doing things. And we don't allow any family, obviously, to be present. It's an extremely difficult, I think, visual process. So we respectfully ask them to kind of go to the lobby or what have you, and then we do what we do. But yeah, it's a real tough job, and that happens about 2 to 3 times a month.
Yeah.
So about 2 to 3 times a month, our lab shuts down. And that's always kind of an interruption in what we're doing, but we want to respect the space. So we clear out the space from anybody that's not supposed to be there. I try not to be in the way because the last thing you really need is your boss overlooking everything you're doing in a challenging circumstance like that. And so I might observe, but I tend to just stay in the back. Let the pros do the job, let them
Yeah.
do what they do.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you some difficult questions. I'm asking them with lots of respect, but I also want to respect the what I perceive to be the thoughts of my audience as they kind of digest this topic. So, my first difficult question is what happens if you lose funding?
Well, that's a great question. So in the past, going back to 1988, what we call the Chatsworth disaster, there have been a number of cryonics organizations. In fact, they've all failed for the most part. The good news is in something where you're doing long-term storage for 50 years or 100 years in the future, Alcor has over 50 years now of survival. And the reason for that is Alcor, like I said, it's split up into two different entities. Okay. And they're both nonprofits. And the Patient Care Trust is the long term care entity. That is extremely well protected, extraordinarily well funded. It's actually much more funded than I am. on the operations side. So if the operations, meaning the research component, were to, for any reason, go out of business or shut down, it kind of wouldn't matter. I mean, it would suck because we really feel like we're doing really good science and work. And we're taking a lot of shots and have for years because people were skeptical. But now, what I call the complementary science, you're starting to see like the Bischoff University of Minnesota, they're doing stuff that Alcor envisioned 25 years ago.
Hmm.
So mainstream universities are just catching up. And that's very often the case, right? It's the innovators, the entrepreneurs that are out there way ahead of the game. And then academia and legal, those all kind of play catch up. So the good news is the long-term care trust is great. you know, they have a very significant source of funding. They have their own legal structure. The bottom line, it would suck for me, but the patients would be fine.
And you've said in another interview that the revival part of it, the idea that it would be the real life Forever Young movie with Mel Gibson, that is what you called the millionaire's game. Is it Alcor's plan to kind of
Billionaires game. Billionaires.
billionaire with a
Yeah,
B?
you need real money for that.
So, is it Alcor's plan to have another branch of the organization that simply pursues the revival part of it, funded by a silly money billionaire?
There actually are existing entities that Alcor is familiar with, if not in some way connected to with staff or other scientific collaborations that are already working on that part of things. I want to be clear that's not what Alcor's daily job is, which I think is what you're getting to. We're in the preservation business, as it were. We're in the science of preservation. Revival doesn't matter if you don't do a good preservation, but revival is extraordinarily expensive to even think about. Neuralink is a great example, but Bezos and Bill Gates have a collaboration on a company that's doing something similar where they're actually connecting the brains and trying to do all that. So that's a game in science where you need billions upon billions of dollars to do it. We don't have billions of dollars to do it, but we are certainly at the forefront and in communication with a number of entities that are trying. And here's the thing, they can't really do that without us. Nowhere else on earth has 50-year-old cryopreserved remains. We're it. And they kind of need that in order to look at any forms of revival. And actually, just this last week, it was super cool. But for the science nerds out there, which I'm like by association, even though I'm not smart enough to hang, the point is this week I was checking out these slides of your neural synaptic connections. So your synapses are where your personality and your character and everything are alive. That's the electrical activity that gives you your character and your personality. And so we were looking at these ultra detailed molecular level slides of the brain firing these chemical impulses at the individual level. And your brain has billions, if not trillions, of these things. And so I say all that because, yes, I mean, we're there talking to the revival people. It's just not realistic for us to be in the business of personally taking lead on that. But again, you have to have us to do any of that. So we're there. We're just not lead on it.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, the question is, could we have an ancillary
Hmm.
entity? Yes, it is possible even to do a for-profit subsidiary. I would not recommend that for the cryopreservation piece because I think the ethical issues of incentivizing kind of going the cheap route, which is why I think so many cryonics organizations have failed. The for-profits have failed because they're using stuff that just isn't state of the art because state of the art is too expensive.
Mm.
That being said, there's other uses for this technology, and we may touch on that, but like trauma medicine, certainly space travel. I mean, space travel is part of this. Those are things that could be monetized. And the way the law works is you can actually do that in a way that the profits feed up into the nonprofit. So that would actually help our research. And that's actually how a big entity called OpenAI, that's how they've been structured with artificial intelligence. Not that that worked out perfectly recently, but there's ways to do it that I think would make sense. And when we get there, I think there's a ton. I mean, there's huge money that people are interested in this space. I just want to do it very carefully, and I want to make sure the ethics of our long-term preservation are maintained. You know, we're members. If we're at an executive level or on the board at Alcor, you're signed up for cryopreservation. I know.
I don't know why that's funny to me, but yeah, it's like, "Welcome to the team, James. By the way, that space is for you."
But think about my job. Like our dart team jokes about messing with my head because I'm a neuro, so they're gonna cut my head off. Like you can cut your boss's head off, right? I mean, that is the literal interpretation of this thing, and so you have to kind of maintain this little sense of humor about
Yeah.
it. And there's limits on what they can do, but they can draw. They've joked about things that they're gonna write on my forehead, so we'll see.
What happens if we colonize Mars? That could happen before revival is possible.
I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't have some form of cryonic preservation. It has applications for animals. It has applications for near extinct animals we talked about. Like animals don't really need to go extinct anymore. We know cloning is possible. And if you get the right organs in the brain and the DNA and what are called glial cells or certain types of stem cells of animals, you can clone them, make new ones.
Are y'all working with Colossal at all on anything?
I'm familiar with Colossal, and we are familiar and perhaps talk to people in that space. It's weird because so many of these things are what they call phantom mode or stealth mode.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've heard that term in technology, but stealth mode is something where any number of people are working on things and they don't want to be public about it because they're trying to raise money and they're kind of in competition with themselves. And we're in this super weird space because we're the nonprofit and we have the decades of experience. So they all kind of, I'm not saying them in particular, I'm not saying any names. I'm simply saying if it touches on animal preservation or cryonics or any of that sort of thing, we've probably got some sort of insight. I have to be careful, but there's a ton of confidentiality in the space because there are people that, I mean, let's be real. There's a lot of money to be made if this works in certain applications.
Yes, and there's a lot of, like, ethical considerations also. And so earlier you mentioned some of the exciting potentials like space travel. These are again the things that kind of recruit the most exciting parts. These are the parts that recruit our imagination. But there's also lots of parts of this that recruit our fears. And so I want you to put your lawyer hat on, not like you ever took it off, but adjust it a tad because I also want to ask you about which of these things that I kind of have in my imagination that you might be most concerned of because this could form a whole new type of classism, right? Like you joked, oh, somebody who is successfully revived, they're never going to buy their own beer ever again. They are going to be a famous person. They're going to be, followed and studied. Overpopulation challenges could worsen if infertility trends continue as they are, and those who are cryopreserved and successfully revived can reproduce with fewer genetic malformities than the rest of us at that time. I mean, that could be some sort of dystopian baby making factory. And these are dark. And like I said, admittedly, not your area of expertise, but from a legal standpoint, I guess where if you were asked, I guess I'm asking you now, so here's your opportunity. Like, which of these things do you feel like we should consider with caution the most?
Well, thanks for asking. That's really important stuff. And there's a reason that Alcor has two or three lawyers on our board and a lawyer in the CEO role. And that is because we do actually heavily consider the ethics of a number of things we do. I mean, to the point where operationally it can almost be frustrating. To your point about a dystopian future, again, I think that before you can even consider the notion that genetic things would be addressed in a cryopreserved person, they're going to be preserved or addressed in living people first, right? And when I say living, I mean people that aren't cryonically preserved and that are otherwise healthy. So I think society inherently, realistically, you can go a thousand directions, and in fact, people do. And I always reference people to the Ken Burns documentary, world famous documentarian, probably the best that's ever lived in our generation. But he did a documentary, and by the way, I am an expert on emerging technology. I can take that title in that I lecture at a number of universities on this. Guest lecture, just lectured at University of Georgia recently this last week. But the point is, in emerging technology, you almost always get fear as the leading emotion before widespread adoption. And cultures have to get past that fear. You see it with driverless cars, which are the relative risk ratio is far better. They're going to say far more lives than they cost. But nonetheless, people are, oh my gosh, they're going to kill people. Some people are going to die in that fashion, but less people will die. That's just a science fact. Okay, by once it's adopted. But with regards to cars, Ken Burns did this documentary, and he literally has film footage from, I think it's the 1920s, of a farmer shooting a real shotgun with things that will kill you at a car with people driving past because they considered it, they literally called it the devil's ride. And they thought that the internal combustion engine was fueled by the fires of hell or something, you know. And so you get these cultural things that are just not scientific, and there's no actual basis for having those ethical fears. Okay. And I think when you look at society and how it develops with regard to any emerging technology, the tendency is actually to overregulate. When things actually become possible, particularly in Western societies, you see overregulation. What you see is the technology being stifled before it can actually reach its potential or maximize potential. So I think in the same vein, none of this is going to happen in a society that has the intent to do harm to citizens, because it's antithetical to that notion that you're going to revive people when that money could be spent on living people. It just doesn't make any logical sense. So if this were to ever happen and work, I think that it will be in a presumably better society, a society that's more accepting of science and its possibilities. And that will have presumably solved the problems that killed the people in the first place. That's kind of a threshold that has to be part of the presumption. The second part of this, the thing that I'm actually most concerned about, is I'm most concerned about the perception or the reality that this is only for wealthy people. Because I think you do create that class system that you're talking about, where the notion is that only billionaires can afford to do this. And that is why Alcor is a nonprofit. That is part of the reason that we think life insurance is the solution to that. I would like to see a lot more diversity in terms of, because science is all about having multiple subject matters to explore. And right now, our membership tends to be male. It tends to be, you know, between the ages of 40 and 60. It tends to be Caucasian, you know, those sorts of things, not exclusively. But the problem in science is that everybody's body mass index, your genes, your race, your weight, any number of factors go into how your cryopreservation looks to us scientifically. So I actually, as a quasi scientist wannabe, I want more people from all over the world and all different types of people to sign up. That's personally important to me. And wealth is not like, you don't get a better cryopreservation necessarily. The only difference that wealth might make is it might make a difference in terms of your transportation if you happen to have a private jet. It might be a little bit faster just because it's there. But in terms of my team, whether you're rich or poor, my DART team is going to recover you in the best way possible. The ethics of that are absolute, because think about it. I'm not a billionaire. And if I go down and I'm in, I don't know, anywhere in the world, you know, that matters to me. What I get paid is public. You know, it's, as a nonprofit, that's another thing. We're heavily audited. We're heavily disclosure friendly, you know. Yeah, you know, that would be my biggest ethical concern. How can we address that? I think Alcor does the best it can. Certainly, you could pay cash for this if you wanted to.
Mhm.
Even the ultra wealthy don't tend to. They didn't get ultra wealthy by being done with their money. They actually
Yeah.
tend to finance it with insurance. So who knows? But that's the singular greatest issue ethically.
As we wrap up, I want to turn back to the organ banking, kind of where we started, because I think what you're doing is so important. I have a dear friend whose brother's life is just on pause because he is waiting for an organ. And he has been waiting for that organ since he was a little boy. And he can't move on with his life. Like he can't bloom into the kind of adult that he wants to be because he is waiting for this organ. So, kind of as we wrap up, how far away is this possibility? And is there any reason that people wouldn't want this to happen? Like, are there any major societal barriers or corporate barriers that we should be aware of as we root for this to come to fruition?
I think, and I'm not the expert, but just in the seat that I occupy, it's an utterly solvable problem. I think it's not been solved because of lack of resources applied. I think that we're on the 95-yard line in American football. There's only 5 yards to go, but it's an incredibly challenging 5 yards. From what I've talked to medical professionals, some of the best in the world, they need about 6 to 8 weeks to do perfect matches, essentially, which means, guess what? No dialysis. It means no anti-rejection meds anymore if you can do these DNA matches. And with AI now, you could do quick matches, within weeks or a month or two. So we're not challenging the world to store organs for 50 years. We're challenging the world to store organs for 8 weeks, which, the less time you have them in cryo storage, probably the better. But that's utterly doable. I think if everybody dropped what they were doing and really applied, it would be 3 to 5 years away. And then on the flip side, though, understand that in reality, that's a multi-billion-dollar a year for-profit industry to keep people on dialysis or to keep people on anti-rejection meds. And if you want to know why medical device or drug companies, which are often the same company, why aren't they putting the money into this? I mean, think about it. That's 10 billion, 20 billion. And on the individual level, until they need an organ, it's not a priority. And by the time they need an organ, they're probably out of their job because they can't function at the C level in some of those companies, right?
Mm.
So I don't want to villainize too many people, but the reality is there's billions of dollars at stake if we're successful. It might shut down some industries, and so there are absolutely political and cultural headwinds that get played to for what we're trying to do. At this point, I'm at a stage in life where I kind of just don't care. I mean, I don't care in terms of, take your best shot. I'm going to continue to try and solve this problem. I'm no longer beholden or no longer need them as clients in my professional life or personal life. I'm not money motivated at all. I didn't take the job for the money. It is extremely personal. And like you said, you have a friend. I had a friend who needed a kidney, and they didn't do anything wrong. That's the unfairness of it all, right? This person didn't do anything. They were just born with this polycystic kidney disease, and very vibrant, very smart person, full of life. And simply for lack of effort and lack of resources applied, their life will be shortened.
Mhm.
And that's absolutely unfair. And it's an utterly solvable problem. And it's not even that complex in the sense of, you can freeze steaks for 6 months or a year. Yeah, I know that's different. Scientists, I get it, but it's not that different. Like, it's solvable. That is frankly what motivates me. That's what wakes me up every day. Whether you think you're going to come back in any meaningful way, again, that's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is science is only advanced by people donating, in this case, your remains and helping fund the science. And we are truly a nonprofit. You can look that up. We're doing it, and I'd prefer the more help, the better.
I think that is the perfect place to wrap up. I'm going to link Alcor's information in the show notes. Thank you so much, James. This has been a great conversation.